This is Heidi Strader with your fire weather briefing for the eastern area. I'm recording this on April 7th for the following week. I thought it would be a good idea to take a look back at some of the trends, not just for the last week, but going back a few more weeks. In the upper left, you can see that this is the temperature anomaly for the month of March. Now, the colors that are yellow or into white weren't much of a significant difference, just a little bit above normal. But you can see that as you get farther south through the eastern area, the difference gets greater and greater for the month of March, with those dark browns being between 7 to 10 degrees warmer than normal. So overall, it was a fairly warm month. However, it looks like when we got into April, a switch kind of flipped, and those green areas throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin, down into Iowa, as well as northern Michigan and the northernmost part of Maine, were below normal temperatures, and some of that was significant, more than 5 degrees colder than normal. However, then there's this very clear line that follows just south of there, where we see numbers were once again warmer than normal. So we get into the areas in the southern part of Illinois, Indiana, over into Ohio, and much of the mid-Atlantic. Those areas had values that were 13 to 16 degrees warmer than normal, with some of those brighter reds, and perhaps even more than that. So April was off to a very warm start in the south, but colder in the north. For precipitation, I've got those same two graphics. In the upper left, we've got the month of March, where we see that there was this band of much wetter conditions throughout the middle of the area, with the green colors being as much as 2 times the normal amount of precipitation for the month. However, that's bookended by drier conditions in much of Minnesota, parts of Iowa, and northern Missouri. And then over in the east, we see a good chunk of New England also on the drier side. It was also fairly dry through parts of the mid-Atlantic and even West Virginia. Then as we roll into April, the first week has brought very wet conditions throughout much of the Great Lakes states and the Midwest. Those purple areas are 3 to 4 times the normal amount of precipitation. Notice, though, that it has continued to be a bit drier through much of the southern part of New England and down into the mid-Atlantic. West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, southern New Jersey did pick up some rain, but then we see another little dry intrusion through the southern part of Indiana and Ohio. Then this bottom center graphic has the precipitation for the last 7 days, with these pink and red values being well over an inch and the yellows pushing towards 3 or 4 inches. So a good swath of precipitation across most of the region in the last week, but there are some drier areas. Again, the southern part of Indiana, Ohio, as well as around the mid-Atlantic, it's been on the drier side. We'll look at this precip graphic again on another slide later in this presentation. For warnings, watches, and advisories, there are some freeze warnings out across parts of Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, and then over into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland area for the morning hours today, and a few of these areas may see some cold temperatures on Thursday morning as well. Let's start today's conversation with the map in the upper center. This is showing where the frontal position is for today, and you can see that this blue area over the Great Lakes is a chance for some mixed precipitation, so temperatures are cold enough to have some snow and ice mixed in. As you get farther south from there, there are rain and thunderstorms in the forecast for much of Iowa, northern Illinois, and even into southern Wisconsin. And you can see on the 24-hour precipitation graphic that there is a little bit of moisture in those areas, but not really a whole lot of rain expected. Those light green numbers are really less than 1/10 of an inch. There's also the chance for a little bit of moisture still holding on over New England for the day today. Minimum RHs tells the story, however, that there is some significant drying out there for Wednesday. Despite the moisture moving into the Midwest, we see some pretty low values for a good chunk of Wisconsin and Minnesota, as well as into Michigan. However, the driest area is focused down in the Ohio drainage, especially along southern Indiana over towards Ohio, West Virginia, and the rest of the mid-Atlantic. Now, up in the Northeast, it's still a little bit on the damper side for today, so not going for anything in northern New England, but a lot of the region does expect to have heightened fire potential for the day today. There are also some stronger winds in the forecast across much of the western half of the region, with a strong southerly flow especially focused over parts of Wisconsin and northern Illinois. For Thursday, we see that temperatures are starting to warm a little bit more, especially through the south central part of the region. Expect to see 60s and 70s start to work their way in, especially from the southwest. There is a good chance for moisture to move through the Great Lakes states again on Thursday, but most of the rest of the region will be on the dry side. And speaking of dry, relative humidities are going to be remarkably low across much of the eastern region. Expect to see a widespread area with RHs getting down into the low to mid-teens, with stronger winds in the forecast over New England, through New York, and then also over into Michigan and northern Ohio. There is elevated concern in a pretty broad area for Thursday as well. On Friday, the push of warm air now shifts farther to the east, and at the same time, more moisture drops down into the Great Lakes states and even into parts of the Mississippi Valley. So relative humidities are moderated for most of the western two-thirds of the region, but we continue to see some much drier conditions throughout that same area of the mid-Atlantic and up into New England. And I will say that the significant fire potential graphic here needs to be updated. I am definitely feeling more confident about putting some higher fire potential over the Northeast. For the most part, winds will not be remarkable on Friday, which may be the saving grace with some of those lower humidities up in the Northeast. Confidence in the medium range is fair as we get into the weekend and early next week. High pressure starts out dominating much of the eastern area, so we see fairly dry conditions for the most part. And then as we move later in the weekend, it looks like another frontal system or two is poised to move into the western portion of the region, and especially the Great Lakes states once again. Notice that the mid-Atlantic stays quite dry throughout this whole period, with very little rain touching the mid-Atlantic coast. And keeping in mind that the light green areas are really just a chance of rain and not necessarily significant widespread precipitation. Taking a look at the week after this and the following weekend, it looks like we're overall in for a warmer than normal pattern, as well as a wetter than normal pattern in most areas. However, both precipitation outlooks put the far southeastern portion of our area in at least a normal to perhaps even drier setup. So that'll be the area to watch through the mid-Atlantic and over into West Virginia and perhaps as far to the northwest as Ohio. I hope most of you have had a chance to look at the outlook for fire potential that was issued at the beginning of April. You can see that for eastern area, we're going with normal conditions. However, there is a wide swath of the southern area that has some higher than normal potential, especially for April, but continuing into May and June, shifting over into Texas a little bit more for July. And out in the west, we see an expansion of the footprint over which there is elevated concern, with a large portion considered as above normal potential, especially as we get into July. In the upper left, we've already seen this precipitation graphic once before, but again noting that much of the region picked up some pretty good precip in the last week, with the exception being in parts of the mid-Atlantic and southern Indiana, Ohio. The snowpack animation shows that really the snow line hasn't changed much. It's kind of come and gone a couple of times. There's been another dusting in the last 24 hours or so that's expanded the area once again, but expect with warmer temperatures coming this weekend that snow will disappear. There is a big rain forecasted for the next 7 days, reaching from Missouri up to the northeast and into the Great Lakes states, and perhaps even the northernmost part of New England for later in the period. But the dry pattern continues to exist through much of southern New England down into the mid-Atlantic states, and that will continue to be the area to watch. I wanted to take a quick nod to the Great Lakes Fire and Fuel site. This is showing the spread index for the next 4 days. And it's pretty glaring that for Wednesday we have the southern part of Minnesota and Wisconsin with some exceptional spread potential, but things quickly taper off there. There is a slight elevated chance in southern Michigan for Thursday. And then it's not until Saturday that we see a little bit of elevated concern again coming back into western Minnesota. Overall, these conditions stay fairly benign for the next few days, mostly because there is another influx or two of moisture coming in. On this page, we see the upper left. We've got the forecasted ERCs for the next couple of days, and the orangish areas are keying in on the southeastern part of Ohio into western West Virginia, and those upward arrows show that the trend overall is rising in that area. So this is a place to keep our eyes on, as we've already been noting due to the deficit of precipitation there. In the lower left, I've got the NASA's Land Information System's green vegetation fraction. So you can see that things really have not started to green up over much of eastern area. There is a small area in coastal Maine, and then parts of Maryland, maybe a little bit of Pennsylvania and down into Delaware are on the greener side. The eastern half of Ohio has also seen some greening, but that's really about it. Parts of Missouri, but not as big of a footprint as we'd hoped to have seen by now. So green up is happening. It's just perhaps a little bit slow. The recent rains and the forecasted rains will help speed this up in the next couple of weeks. Meanwhile, on the drought monitor, there's very little change since the last issuance. The only thing that has changed is there is some softening of those conditions from northern Missouri and southern Iowa over towards Ohio. On the right-hand side of my summary slide, I just wanted to show a couple other NASA sport graphics. The upper one is that soil moisture graphic down to 100 centimeters that I often show in these briefings. And you can see that there is still some red on that graphic, but there has been a change. In fact, the lower map shows the change in the last 7 days for the deeper portion of that soil moisture reading, and the greens and blues there over much of the Midwest are showing that there has been a softening of conditions. Meanwhile, in the east, for southern New York and northern Pennsylvania, out towards southern New England, there's been a more significant drying trend. In summary, this week is going to see another series of rain and mixed precipitation events for much of the West and the Great Lakes states. Meanwhile, farther to the east, it looks to stay quite dry. Fire potential is going to be elevated through at least Thursday and then start to slowly decrease as the weekend approaches, especially out in the west. But the mid-Atlantic is going to be an area to watch throughout the next 7 days, as virtually no precipitation is expected to come into that area. Keep in mind that we're still in the prime spring burning window, and low humidities and gusty winds won't take long to quickly dry out fuels and elevate fire potential. That concludes my presentation for this week. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.